What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we'll be talking about muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Let's get it popping. Before we begin, I'd just like to apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I blow my nose or if I cough or whatnot, I apologize for that. So let's start here. Talking about the benefits of skeletal muscle. Why do we have muscle in our body? There are 4 key reasons why we do have skeletal muscle. Number 1, it's a good source of protection and shock absorption, as a lot of the muscle is superficial, meaning it's on top of our vital organs. So basically, it can protect our vital organs from getting hit. In addition, every time I step, every time I collide with something, there is some sort of shock or impact forces that go throughout my body, and muscles can help absorb that shock there, by pulling on bones there, therefore minimizing the impact on vital organs there as you move. Number 2, skeletal muscles assist with blood flow. Specifically, helps push the blood from your legs, back up to your heart. Number 3 is heat production. So as muscles contract, it creates heat, therefore keeping you warmer. Number 4 there, skeletal muscle helps with movement and posture. As muscles, as we know there, they contract there, pulling your arms and legs together, moving them around, things along those lines. So therefore, it helps produce movement, but it also can help assist with posture. For example, if I'm standing upright, my lower back muscles help keep me upright, because if my lower back muscles would relax, I would fall down. So muscles also help with maintaining posture. Now, how are muscles structured? What makes up an actual muscle? So starting off with just the basic structure there, we've got the muscle cell, otherwise known as the muscle fiber. And essentially, we have a bunch of these muscle fibers, muscle cells that come together here, and all of them together creates a muscle bundle, otherwise known as a fasciculus. So fasciculus is the same thing as a muscle bundle, or basically a large group of muscle fibers. And then we've got a bunch of these muscle bundles that come together, and that creates your entire muscle. Now, in order to hold these muscle fibers together, these muscle bundles together there, we need connective tissue between these muscle fibers there and these muscle bundles. So first of all, starting at the very small level and gradually moving out there, we've got the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is connective tissue that covers the muscle fibers. And the sarcolemma there is attached to the endomysium. Endomysium is essentially a covering on top of the sarcolemma. So essentially we've got this, I like to think about it as shrink wrap there. So around each muscle fiber, we got this shrink wrap called sarcolemma. On top of the sarcolemma, we've got the endomysium, another layer of shrink wrap. Then on top of that, we got the perimysium, which covers the fasciculi, meaning that muscle bundle. So perimysium covers every muscle bundle. And then we've got the epimysium is the connective tissue that covers the entire muscle. Now, along with these different parts that cover muscles there, we've got tendons. And essentially what tendons are is they are what connect muscle to bone. So the epimysium, since it surrounds the entire muscle cell there, it is continuous with tendons. And so again, these tendons there will connect to your bones there, the muscle to bones there, which allows you to create movement. Now, what's important to note here in these tendons are not made up of the same material throughout. Essentially, as you go along the tendon, it goes from a more flexible substance to a substance that has greater amount of ground substance and mineralization, essentially meaning that it becomes a little bit stiffer there. So here's an example here of a muscle attaching to a bone, and here right here is the tendon. So we got muscle, bone, and attaching there is their tendon. So the tendon goes from more flexible substance, more stretchier, to stiffer, more rigid substance there. And it's a gradual change there from very flexible to very rigid. Here's a diagram, a picture of the different parts of the muscle there and all the connective tissue between it. So as you see down here, we've got our muscle fiber here. So this circular thing in between there, we got some smaller things in our muscle fiber. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But essentially, you got your muscle fiber here. surrounding that muscle fiber is your sarcolemma. So, surrounding the sarcolemma there, we've got this connective tissue, which is your endomysium. Then we've got all these muscle fibers together. That's your fasciculus, otherwise known as your muscle fiber bundle. And around the fasciculus is your paramecium. Okay? And then we've got a bunch of these muscle fiber bundles together. Okay? Surrounding that is going to be your epimysium, okay, which is your entire muscle cell there, and that connects to your tendons. Moving deeper into our muscle fibers there, okay, what you'll notice is we've got these very small contractile units there of muscle. So essentially, one attached to the other, okay, separated by this blue zigzag line there. We got individual contractile units there. And we'll talk about what those individual contractile units are in the next several slides. So what this, between these two, we call these Z lines there, these two blue zigzag points there, we call this a sarcomere. And again, this is the basic contractile unit of muscle. So essentially, as the muscle contracts and gets shorter there, okay, these Z lines there, okay, will become closer and closer together. Now, in your sarcomere, there are two different types of protein chains, and these are pretty important. We've got our thick filament, which is highlighted in pink, purplish right here. These are called myosin, otherwise known as thick filament. And then on the outside there, highlighted in blue here, we've got thin filament, otherwise known as actin. So if you hear the term thick filament, know we're referring to myosin. If you hear the term thin filament, that's referring to actin. Now what's important to note here is our myosin do not move. Okay? So again, our thick filament does not move there. Okay? What does move is the actin, okay? The thin filament in blue there surrounding. Okay? So essentially, these actin here, they are connected with this Z line there. Okay? And what happens is these kind of stay still there, and the myosin in purple here, they have these what are called myosin heads. Okay? And what these heads are kind of like oars in the water if you're rowing a boat. So these heads there on these myosin will attach to the actin, the blue actin, and kind of rowing or pulling, okay? And that pulls the contractile unit together. When that myosin head connects with the actin, grabs onto it, that's considered a cross bridge. Okay? And again, kind of like rowing a boat in the water there, these myosin heads will connect with and pull on the actin to bring them closer together. Now, what's important to note here is we get to a point where, yes, we can shrink the sarcomere closer and closer together when it contracts, but eventually it gets to the point where the actin filaments, in blue here, they run into each other from the opposite sides. So essentially, we can only shorten a sarcomere so much. Are we still producing force when it's completely shortened like this? Absolutely. So, for example, if I'm bear hugging my pillow there, I'm squeezing it and someone's trying to take my pillow away, by me squeezing on it, I might not be contracting my muscle even shorter, but I'm still producing force. So we are producing force even in this very shortened position. And essentially, we continue to produce force, okay, as long as there is a stimulus from our nervous system. So as long as our central nervous system keeps telling our body, I'm going to squeeze, keep producing force there, okay, the muscle contraction will continue to occur. Okay. Then eventually, at some point in time, we will relax, either voluntarily or our body just cannot maintain it anymore. Okay. Now, what's important to note is muscle relaxation, when our body relaxes, can occur only as long as ATP is present. Remember that ATP is our body's currency, or what it uses to create energy. So as long as ATP is present, our muscle can relax. Now this slide here, what this slide shows is on the y-axis, we got the amount of tension the muscle is producing. And on the bottom is how long that muscle is compared to its resting length, okay, in terms of percentage. So if it roughly around here where my mouse is pointing right now, that's roughly around 100% of resting length. But what's important to note here is this red line shows that different amounts of tension are created depending on how long or how short this muscle is. What you'll notice is as we get longer and longer and longer, okay, the muscle tension starts to go down. Okay? And that's because the longer the muscle is, the less overlap the actin have with the myosin. Therefore, we're not able to create as many cross bridging, which means we can't create as much tension. So let me show that here. So let's say this up top here, this is the sarcomere, and it's really long. So this is a case where the muscle is quite lengthened. Notice we only got a few of these cross bridges, these myosin cross bridges. They're able to attach to the actin. These ones over here cannot attach to that actin because it's not overlapping. Therefore, the muscle cannot produce as much force in this particular situation. However, as the muscle continues to get shorter and shorter and shorter, more myosin cross bridges can occur, therefore creating more force because we've got more oars, using our rowing analogy there, in the water. So more cross bridges can happen because more actin is overlapping the myosin. Now, on the flip side of that there, when we get to full contraction, okay, meaning that we've shortened that sarcomere as much as we can, there are no more cross bridges that can be formed there. So therefore, it's just not able to form as much. So therefore, okay, we see a drop off in the force after that certain point there. So maximum tension in muscle is typically can be created at approximately a 120% of resting length. So essentially, when that muscle is slightly a little bit longer than what it is at rest, that in general typically is when the muscle can produce the most amount of force. This is something that I would make a note of. 120% of resting length is when the muscle can produce the most force in general. Now, muscle fibers, they're kind of on a continuum on what kind of type they are. And these certain types of muscle fibers have different characteristics. We typically, though, categorize muscle fiber types into one of three categories. We got type 1, otherwise known as slow twitch, type 2A, otherwise known as fast twitch A, and type 2X, okay, fast twitch X, formerly called type 2B, depending on what you're looking at in the literature. So these comparatively have different types of characteristics. First of all, okay, how quickly can these muscle fibers contract compared to each other? So a slow twitch is kind of what it says there. So its contraction speed is going to be very slow compared to type 2A, which is a little bit faster, intermediate speeds. And then type 2X had the fastest contraction speeds compared to the other two muscle fiber types. And then we've got these muscle fiber types are going to use different energy systems. And we'll talk about energy systems a little bit later on in our course here. But to know here, type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers typically use the oxidative energy systems. Basically, energy systems that use oxygen, which is why it's called oxidative. Type 2A will use some oxygen energy systems, but also some glycolytic energy systems. And glycolytic is an energy system that is anaerobic, meaning it does not use oxygen. And then we move down to fast twitch X there. They do not use barely any, if any at all, their aerobic energy systems. So their main energy systems are going to be glycolytic or anaerobic. Moving back up to type 1 there, okay, the amount of tension and how quickly they can fatigue, okay, compares differently between the different muscle fiber types. So because slow twitch muscle fibers have the slowest contraction speed, they produce the lowest tension. So that's the downside. But the positive side is they are very fatigue resistant, meaning type 1 muscle fibers can continue contracting over and over and over again for a longer period of time without getting tired. Type 2A there, okay, they creates moderate tension. So more tension than the type 1 muscle fibers because they have factor contractile speeds. They also are fatigue resistant, so therefore they don't get as tired as quickly, but they are not as fatigue resistant as type 1. So type 1 muscle fibers are the most fatigue resistant, meaning they don't get tired. type 2A do get tired, but not as but they get more tired quickly than type 1, but not as much as type 2X. So type 2X creates the largest amount of tension, but they are also the fastest to get tired. So we can produce a lot of tension quickly with type 2X, but they're going to typically drop out, we say, or they might get tired very easily and not able to work anymore. In the average person, the amount of type 1 muscle fibers are going to be typically 50 to 55% of all the muscle fiber types. Type 2A is going to be typically 30 to 35%, and type 2X is going to be 15% of muscle fiber types in the average person. Now, if we're looking at professional athletes, typically professional athletes will have a greater percentage of some muscle fiber types versus others, and those will help them become more successful. So for example, type 1, yes, they don't produce a lot of force quickly, but they can continue to produce force over and over again for a long period of time. So because type 1 muscle fiber types are so fatigue resistant, they are typically create a greater percentage of the muscle fibers in athletes that are in long duration sports. Things like cross country, triathlons, long distance cycling. Type 2A muscle fibers there, being somewhat fatigue resistant, yet producing a decent amount of force there, they're going to be more common in explosive sports that require some sort of endurance. For example, soccer is a sport where you might be jogging around for a lot of the game, but then there might be certain points at times where you need to sprint fast to go get the ball, get a breakaway there to score. Likewise, basketball. I'm constantly got to be ready playing defense there, and sometimes I might have to get the ball quickly and sprint fast to get a fast break and to dunk it on the other end. Hockey is another sport where you got to go very quickly and relatively short bursts of high-intense exercise with very minimal recovery in between. Then we got type 2X. Creates a lot of tension there, but they fatigue very quickly. So these muscle fiber types could be more predominant in explosive, short-duration sports. So things like high jumpers, long jumpers, triple jumpers. Things like 100-meter sprinters there. Things like shot putters, American football players. Okay, where they have to be very explosive, very quick, only for a short period of time, and then they get a lot of rest in between. Speaking of 100-meter sprinters, an example of a athlete who has more type 2A muscle fibers would be something like a 400-meter runner or an 800-meter runner, because they got to sprint very quickly, but they don't have a lot of rest there. So therefore, 400-meter runners and 800-meter runners would also fall in our type 2A muscle fiber category. Here's a picture of a alpha motor neuron, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, innervating the muscle fibers and looking at the different types of muscle fibers there. So we've got, on the left here, we've got our type 2X muscle fibers there. In the middle here, we've got our type 2A. And then on the right here, we got type 2-1. So what you notice here is we've got twitch diagrams in the top, essentially showing how much force can be produced with one, signal to the muscle. So you notice our fast twitch muscle fibers, type 2X there, produce a lot of force very quickly, but they fatigue off very fast. Type 2A muscle fibers produce some force, but they don't fatigue as quickly as their type 2X. Versus type 1, don't produce as much force as type 2A, but they can produce force over a longer period of time. And then we've got rate of fatigue in the charts in the bottom here. So type 2X fatigue very quickly. After a couple of minutes, we're basically done with using our 2X muscle fibers. Type 2A muscle fibers can maintain a decent amount of force past 6 minutes and even continue to produce some force, although very minimal, at like 60 minutes and beyond. And type 1 muscle fibers there, basically maintaining their force production there for an hour or more. Again, this is just a visual diagram of what we just discussed in the previous slide. So we're going to talk about muscle fibers there. And as I showed in the previous diagram here, there's a nerve cell that connects with our muscle fibers. And the nerve cell and the muscle fibers together, that creates what we call our motor unit. So basically, our motor unit is made up of an alpha motor neuron, okay? And this alpha motor neuron there connects to our muscle fibers there. So all muscle fiber contraction is controlled by our motor units. Now, what's important to note is not all motor units are the same size. We might have one nerve cell, alpha motor neuron there, that connect to many different muscle fibers, versus some alpha motor neurons will only connect to a few different muscle fibers. And whether a alpha motor neuron there connects to a lot of muscle fibers or very few muscle fibers there is determined by the need of precision for that particular muscle group. So where fine motor control is required, things like moving your fingers to manipulate what you're holding, or maybe small movements in your eyes, for example, we're going to have one alpha motor neuron there for only a small amount of muscle fibers. So maybe this alpha motor neuron would only connect with one muscle fiber, maybe 2, 3, 4, but a very small chunk of muscle fibers are connected by this alpha motor neuron. However, where fine motor control is not necessary, such as in your lower back there or in your thighs there, we can have one alpha motor neuron that connects with hundreds of different muscle fibers. With our motor units, okay, the motor unit and everything in it there obeys the all or none law, okay, meaning we either produce force or we don't produce force at all. So that alpha motor neuron will either fire completely or not at all there. So this is the all or nothing law. Here's a visual diagram of what we just discussed on the previous slide. So you'll see on the left here, we've got a bunch of different alpha motor neurons, but you'll notice they only connect with like 2 to 3 different muscle fibers. These alpha motor neurons, these motor units there, will connect with muscles that require a lot of precision. So these would be muscles of like the fingers, the muscles that move your eyes, things along those lines. First, on the right here, you got one alpha motor neuron that connects with many different muscle fibers. This is where we don't need a whole lot of precision. So these would be situations where of alpha motor neurons connecting to muscles in your lower back, maybe in your thighs, maybe in your biceps, things along those lines. So we talked briefly about muscle firing, essentially that alpha motor neuron sending a signal down, okay, from where the body's located, maybe it's in the brain, maybe it's in the spinal cord there. It sends that signal for that muscle to contract all the way down the alpha motor neuron there, and then it goes to our muscle fibers, where our muscle fiber then will contract to produce force. So if one signal is fired down that alpha motor neuron, okay, meaning that motor unit fires just once, okay, the muscle fibers, okay, that it innervates will express a twitch response, okay, meaning that we're going to produce force, but that force is going to drop off pretty quickly. So essentially just kind of signal go, muscle contracts a little bit there, and then relaxes. Okay. This also happens in cases where the signal might be sent very slowly. So I might say contract, contract, contract. And in these cases there, we'd see small blips in force production there, but not a whole lot of tension is produced. However there, if a motor unit fires in rapid succession, okay, meaning that I send a signal once, then again and again and again and again. So by constantly sending a signal for that motor unit there to contract, what happens is force production does not have enough time to drop off before another contraction is produced, and another contraction is produced, and another contraction is produced. And what you'll notice is a lot more force there is created when we send signals down this alpha motor neuron there, producing force. So the sum of these forces add up there to create what we call a tetanic response. Okay? So meaning basically we're like constantly firing that alpha motor neuron there, producing a ton of force. Okay? Here's an example I'd like to think about here. Okay? Let's say I'm boxing. Okay? This example right here would be like throwing one punch and hitting someone. Is that going to hurt? Yeah, maybe not there. But if I throw that same punch over and over again, very rapid fire there with very little break in between, okay, that sucker's going to hurt a lot. I'm probably going to get a lot bigger bruise from firing a punch this amount of times versus this amount of times. So essentially, one way that our body is able to produce more force there is to send signals down that alpha motor neuron to fire a lot faster, okay, a lot more frequently than it normally would. Now, muscle actions, we've been talking about forces, we've been talking about contraction there. And what's important to note is that when a muscle contracts, it pulls with equal force on each attachment. So muscle, again, will connect, or a muscle there connects two different bones together. And so when it pulls, contracts to get shorter there, it'll pull with equal force on each attachment site. So important to note here is muscles can only shorten. Muscles can never make themselves longer. A muscle may get longer because, like, force of gravity or something's pulling the muscle longer. Maybe it's the way our other muscles are contracting, which causes another muscle to lengthen. But the muscles themselves cannot actually lengthen. I can't just cut a muscle out, slap on the table, and say, hey, muscle, lengthen. Okay? We could contract it if we stimulated it with an electrical signal there, making it shorter, but we can't actually actively cause a muscle to lengthen. So with muscles there, I think I mentioned previously that there are typically two attachment points with muscles. Sometimes there might be more attachment points than just two. Okay? But typically, these attachment points are grouped into two different, I guess, scenarios there. Some attachment points are categorized more as origin, okay, versus other attachment points are more categorized as insertions. Those points of the muscles that are more origin in nature are typically the parts of the muscle that attach more proximally to the body, meaning attach closer to the center there. And another way to look at it is typically origin attachment points are typically at points on the body that typically move less, versus the insertion points are typically parts of the muscle that attach more distally or further from the center. And mechanically, it's typically the attachment points that moves more. Here's an example. So you got your bicep muscle. Your bicep muscle there is between your elbow and your shoulder. If I flex my elbow there, creating a bicep muscle, or making my bicep muscle contract there, what you'll notice here is my forearm moves a lot more than my shoulder does. My bicep will attach at the shoulder, okay, and onto the forearm there. So the part of the bicep that attaches at the forearm there is going to move more. So that's the insertion point of the bicep, versus the origin point of the bicep would be at the shoulder. And these origin insertions are important to know is because if you know where the origin insertions are, and knowing that muscles can only shorten themselves, you can always determine the line of pull. I mean, you can always determine how that muscle is going to contract. You kind of know what movement is going to occur. Now with muscle contraction types, okay, muscle contraction essentially is that muscle is producing force. We've got three different types of contraction. The first type we'll talk about is concentric contraction. And this is the typical type of contraction you might think about when a muscle is producing force. Okay? So basically in concentric contractions there is that muscle is actively shortening. And so therefore the muscle is shortening. Okay? That means the muscle is squeezing together, getting shorter there. Okay? This would be the more common ones that you would see. For example, if I'm doing a bicep curl, okay, and I bring that dumbbell from closer to the ground up to my chest as I'm doing my bicep curls, that act of moving the dumbbell from the ground there, okay, all the way up to my chest there, that would be considered a concentric contraction because my bicep muscle is shortening. Another way to think about it here is that if we look at the resistance load, or essentially the weight or weight stack, if the weight or the weight stack is going upwards against gravity, it is considered a concentric contraction. Here's another example when using a machine. So if I'm doing a lat pull down, taking my arms above my head and pulling the bar, which is attached to a cable, to my chest there, okay, I'm using my lats, my big back muscles there. And as I pull down, you'll notice that weight stack will move up. So weight stack is moving up, meaning that my lat muscles there, latissimus dorsi muscles there, are performing a concentric contraction. If I'm performing a bench press, I'm pushing that weight from my chest up above my head there. And so therefore that weight is moving up. Therefore, the act of pushing from my chest upwards is considered a concentric contraction. Eccentric contractions are the exact opposite of concentric contractions. So, yes, we are still producing force, okay, but the muscle is getting longer. And this occurs when essentially the weight is too heavy, or a couple of different things. The weight is either too heavy for us to actually move up, so instead the weight pulls us down. Or if we think about it in terms of a submax standpoint, or meaning we're not at our maximal force production output there, but essentially is we are controlling the weight down. Here's an example of this here. If I'm doing a bench press, okay, as I bring that bar to my chest muscles are lengthening. They are getting longer. Now they're still producing force, because if my chest muscles were not producing force as I brought that bar to my chest, that bar would just flop down and hit my chest there. So my chest muscles are still producing force, but they're getting longer as they produce force. This would be considered an eccentric contraction. Now on the flip side, compared to the concentric contraction, if we watch a resistance load, if the weight or weight stack is going down with gravity, it's considered an eccentric contraction. So again, bicep curl. If I take the bicep or my dumbbells there from my chest there, and I lower those dumbbells there towards the ground, my bicep muscle is lengthening while producing force. Therefore, that would be considered an eccentric contraction. And then finally, we've got isometric contractions. So this means we're producing force there, but the muscle is neither lengthening or shortening. It's maintaining its same length there. So essentially, the amount of force that's being produced by your muscles is enough to maintain its position. A couple of common examples of this would be, number one, holding a front plank position. By holding a front plank, being on my elbows there and on my toes, my ab muscles are contracting, keeping myself in a straight line there. Okay? Because if they're not contracting there, my stomach would just flop to the ground. But I'm maintaining that position, so that would be an example of a concentric contraction. Another common example might be is if I am doing a wall sit. So sitting against the wall there, gravity wants to pull me down, but my leg muscles are contracting to prevent myself from falling to the ground, and I'm maintaining that position. So a wall sit would be another example of a isometric contraction. So on the bottom here of this particular graph here, we look at isometric contractions, concentric and eccentric there. Okay, and we're looking at the amount of tension that is produced. Okay, what you'll notice here is that eccentric contractions can produce a lot more tension compared to concentric contractions there. Okay, so that means that we could actually lower a heavier weight that we could actually lift to our chest on a bench press. So let's say, for example, I'm performing bench press, and the maximum amount of weight I can perform on a bench press is 200 pounds. Okay. What this means is that I could take 200 pounds, come down to my chest and touch, and then lock it back out at the top. However, what I could do if I wanted to is I could put 225 pounds on the bar, so an extra 25 pounds of what I was normally doing, and I could actually lower that weight to my chest under control. Okay. Now I wouldn't be able to push it back up, but I could lower it there. So eccentric contractions can actually produce more force than concentric contractions, and isometric contractions can produce more or less force than eccentric, but more force than concentric. So with this here, okay, one of these reasons why the tension tends to go down a little bit as the concentric contraction is happening is that during concentric contractions, there is some point in time when our myosin released from the actin, meaning our cross bridges, okay, as I think about my rowing analogy, as I'm rowing, into the water there has to be some point in time where my oars have to come out of the water before they can pull again. Okay? So likewise, the same thing with producing concentric contractions. As I'm producing concentric contractions, my cross bridges, my myosin heads, will attach to the actin, but then they sometimes have to release and then reattach, release, reattach, release. And therefore, that's one reason that causes that concentric force to be less than isometric or eccentric. During isometric contractions, those cross bridges maintain their attachment points, okay, but they're not able to move it as much, or they're not able to move it. So they maintain the contraction, myosin heads attach to the actin, maintain that contraction holding on there, but it doesn't actually shorten the muscle fiber. Okay. During eccentric contractions there will be the myosin heads that will be attaching there, okay? But typically they're going to be a greater amount of cross bridges at any given time compared to concentric there. So since there's going to be typically more cross bridges there, that's another reason why they can create more force compared to concentric. So again, you are stronger eccentrically more than you are concentrically. Muscle rolls here. Okay? Two opposite muscle rolls is we've got some muscles that are agonists and some muscles are antagonists. And the analogy I like to use is superheroes are considered agonists, while the villains there are considered antagonists. Okay? And what agonists are that muscles that are producing the movement there. Okay? They're the ones that are creating the force. So for example, if I'm doing my bicep curls again, and I'm pulling those dumbbells there from the ground, okay, to my chest there, my bicep muscles are considered the agonists. Okay? So they are the ones that are actually doing the movement. The antagonists, okay, are the muscles on the opposite side creating force, or otherwise known as torque there, on the opposite side of the agonist muscle. So the muscle that's opposite the biceps brachii there are going to be your triceps muscles. So muscles on the back of your arm are your triceps, versus muscles on the front are your biceps. And essentially what antagonistic muscles will do is they could reduce, or they could produce some force, okay, that could in turn there prevent the agonist muscles from producing as much force. Okay? And this typically, or one reason this is actually helpful would be, for example, if I'm making a throw as a baseball pitcher, so I throw and I get the muscles on the front of my shoulders there, okay, are creating are contracting there to help throw that ball to the catcher. I have to have muscles on the back side of my shoulder to help prevent that shoulder from continuing to move forward. Because if I didn't have those antagonistic muscles on the back of my shoulder, what would happen is I would throw my shoulder out of its socket there and my shoulder would dislocate. So antagonistic muscles would work in opposition there of the agonists there. And sometimes this is valuable, for example, again, in the case of the pitcher there, helping prevent an injury. And then we've got stabilizer muscles and neutralizer muscles. Okay? What stabilizer muscles do is that they are isometrically active, meaning these muscles essentially stay the same length there, and they assist a movement to help it become more efficient there. For example, your trapezius and rhomboid muscles. Okay? These are muscles of your upper back there. Okay? And they prevent your scapula or your shoulder blades from moving a lot when you're doing a bicep curl. Because without these muscles activating there, if I would try to pull that dumbbell up to my chest there, my shoulders again would move forward and would not be as efficient. Now, neutralizer muscles, they also prevent unwanted movement as well. So just like the stabilizers, neutralizers produce or prevent unwanted movements, but they do so by canceling out an unwanted line of pull from an agonist. So for example, if I'm doing my bicep curls, the biceps brachii flexes the elbow and supinates the forearm. Supination of the forearm meaning that my palm is going to be up. Okay. Now, if I would want to do a bicep curl, but instead of my palm up, I wanted to do it palm down, which would be forearm supination, The pronator teres is active to prevent my palm from going up. So neutralizer there prevents an unwanted movement. Stabilizer muscle assists in the movement by keeping some parts stable. So we got two different types of tension that occur as we're creating muscle contraction there. We've got active tension versus passive tension. And what active tension is the tension that a muscle can develop when the actin and the myosin cross bridge, okay, or where they interact there. At about 60% of a muscle's resting length, okay, the actin and the myosin hit the opposite Z line and no more tension can be produced there. Essentially meaning that sarcomeres become as short as it possibly can. Now, beyond 160% of resting length, there's no longer any actin-myosin overlap. I mean, the actin and myosin cannot create cross bridges. Okay? Therefore, with no cross bridges, mean we have no tension. So therefore, the range of active tension, okay, meaning the range where the muscle can actually produce force there, is approximately 60 to 160% of resting length. And this is something I want to make a note of. So active tension range is 60% of resting length to 160% of resting length, with the peak tension occurring at roughly about 120% of resting length, as we mentioned before. So peak tension, 120% of resting length. Active tension ranges anywhere between 60 to 160. So here's a diagram of it. So when, as you can see right here, when that sarcomere is really close, okay, what you'll notice here is the actin actually cross each other, preventing these cross bridges from attaching to this actin here, like you can up here. Therefore, the muscle is super short there. We're missing out on some cross bridges, therefore not producing as much force when the muscle is really short, roughly 60% of resting length. Likewise, when that muscle gets greater than 160% of resting length, our cross bridges cannot occur anymore because the actin are too far apart. Therefore, again, that's why force production is very low at 60 and 160, okay, with maximum amount of tension at about 120%. So along with active tension, meaning essentially the tension created by the muscle, we've also got passive tension. And this passive tension comes from our connective tissues, our sarcolemma, endomysium, paramysium, epimysium, and our tendons there. So these connective tissues there that surround our muscles and different muscle parts there, as well as the parts that connect our muscle to our bones, they create tension as well. I like to think about them in terms of rubber bands. And they're called passive tension because there's no sort of like activity that's going on. I can't tell my tendons to contract, or I can't tell my endomysium to contract there. The muscles are doing the contracting, but the connective tissue, kind of being like rubber bands there, they create some passive tension as well, just by hanging on there. Now, what's important to note here is passive tension increases as muscles are stretched beyond resting length. And that would make sense there. If I take a rubber band and I stretch it further and further and further, okay, it produces more force than if I would release it, it would snap back a lot faster. Likewise, the more connective tissue, things like tendons, things like the sarcolemma, are stretched, the more force that they can produce. This is why passive tension allows a muscle to develop tension potentially beyond 160% of resting length. So if a muscle was 200% of resting length there, no active tension would be being produced, but there would be a ton of passive tension being produced, which again is one reason why that we can maintain some sort of joint stability and the muscle or joints would not become dislocated. So this combination of active and passive tension leads to a maximum tension occurring at about 120% of resting length, as I mentioned previously. Okay. So 120% of resting length, maximum amount of tension. Active tension range from 60 to 160, and passive tension can produce force even beyond 160%. Now, if a muscle can be stretched beyond 160%, okay, then maximum tension will occur at maximal muscle length. And here's a diagram that kind of shows it here. So we've got in the solid blue line is our active tension. Okay, so this is the muscle producing tension. So what you notice at about 60% of resting length, muscle tension will increase about 120% of resting muscle length. And then from 120 to 160%, that muscle continues to produce tension, okay, but it drops off until it gets to 160%. So beyond this point here, none of the tension being produced is being produced from the muscle fibers. However, you'll see that at about 120% of resting length there, that's when passive tension starts to come. So our connective tissues start to stretch and stretch and stretch, so they can produce more and more and more tension. Okay. Now the combination of the active tension and the passive tension there, okay, creates the total amount of tension actual with our black line, solid line. And so you'll see initially drops because our active tension is decreasing. But then once we get beyond 160% of resting length, you'll notice that our actual tension continues to increase more and more and more, because our passive tension creates that tension. And as long as we don't tear our connective tissue, we can stretch beyond 160% of our resting length there, so that our actual amount of tension, okay, can be maximized beyond 160%. Now with muscles here, some muscles cross only one joint, and some muscles can cross multiple joints. Single joint muscles are going to be the more common ones that we typically see there, but they only cross one joint there, and they have a limited range of motion. So this is where they again can create tension between 60 to 160% of their resting length. For single joint muscles, maximum tension occurs at about 120% of resting length. So single joint muscles, max tension 120%, with the active tension range of 60 to 160%. Now, multiple joint muscles, things like your hamstring muscles there, they will cross more joints, okay? Biarticular muscles specifically cross two joints. And these can be stretched beyond 160% of their resting length. So therefore, these multiple joint muscles will maximize their tension beyond 160%. So, single joint muscle, okay, max amount of tension occurs at 120% of resting length. Versus multiple joint muscles, their maximum amount of tension is created after 160%. The amount of tension that you can develop in multiple joint muscles or biarticular muscles is dependent on what is happening at the other side of the muscle. Here's one example of this. We've got active insufficiency. What active insufficiency is when a multiple joint muscle, so a muscle that spans two different joints there, when it shortens to a length where it can no longer produce effective force. So we see this in the top here, this person performing a leg curl. All right, because his hips are straighter here, his hamstring muscles, okay, are shorter at the butt. And because they're shorter at the butt there, this muscle's not as long. And we talked about with biarticular muscles, which hamstrings are, create the most amount of tension beyond 160% of resting length. And so therefore, because this is shorter right here, the muscle's not stretched as far, so it can't produce as much force here when he brings his heels to his butt. However, in this example here with this machine, notice there's a kind of an incline here, and the hips are higher at this point. So when the hips are higher at this point, now the hamstring muscles are lengthened more, meaning they can produce more force in this particular position. Okay. So active insufficiency is a muscle is too short to produce a lot of tension there. Keeping the hamstring muscles in mind again, we also got passive insufficiency. This is the inability of a muscle to lengthen to see that full range of motion across all of its joints simultaneously. So for example here, our hamstring muscles cross our butt and our knees. You'll notice in picture A here, the hamstring at the knee there is lengthened the most. So it's lengthened as far as it can at the knee. However, the hamstring muscle at the butt is not lengthened as much as it can. Okay, it's only somewhat lengthened. Now, if I would bend my knee, now all of a sudden my hamstring muscle at my butt there can lengthen even further. So by bending my knee, I'm actually able to get my hamstring muscle longer around my butt. So with muscles that cross multiple joints there, by shortening the muscle at one joint, at the other joint, it can now stretch further. This is considered passive insufficiency. So last chapter we talked about the bones, and this chapter we talked about muscles. So the musculoskeletal system incorporates all of our muscles. Okay? These again are the active elements of our system. We got our connective tissue. Okay? These are our cartilage, ligaments, tendons, and we would also classify bone as connective tissue as well. Okay? So muscles and connective tissue altogether, that creates our musculoskeletal system, our bones and our muscles and our tendons and connective tissue. Now, our connective tissue, as I kind of mentioned a little bit before there, it's made up of ground substance minerals, okay, but it's also made up of collagen, elastin, and water. And what collagen and elastin are they are proteins that determine our mechanical properties of our particular connective tissues there. Okay? And I'll explain a little bit more in the next coming slides. So collagen and elastin are basically opposites of each other. Collagen is going to be the most abundant substance in connective tissue, meaning it's going to make up more of the connective tissue than elastin will. Now, collagen is very, very stiff, okay, meaning that it has very high tensile strength, but has difficulty resisting compression. Think of it kind of like a rope, okay? So if I pulled on both ends of a rope there, okay, it would be very firm, it would be very taut, it would be very strong. Okay? However, if I were to try to set something on top of the rope, okay, and the rope was vertical, that rope would just collapse. So collagen there works the same way. So if collagen makes up, whether it be tendons, ligaments, bones, whatnot, if it's trying to be pulled apart, it's going to be very strong, okay? But if it's going to be pushed together, okay, it's not as effective. Versus elastin, think of elastin being very flexible, okay? It's very pliant and extensible, meaning we can stretch elastin, we can't stretch collagen. So with our connective tissues there, the strength of all our different connective tissues is affected by age and physical activity. With physical activity, if we exercise on a regular basis, okay, which would be regular cycles of loading, and then unloading being our rest periods. So if we have portions in time where we exercise and where we rest, and we do this in a progressive manner over the course of a long period of time there, this increases connective tissue strength. So if I jog, like every day there, so I'll jog for 30 minutes, okay? I jog every day with that there. While I'm jogging, that's cycle of loading. And then when I rest the 23 and a half hours between times when I jog there, those would be periods of unloading. And that will increase the density of my bones. It would increase the my tendon strength there and pliability. And it would increase the strength there of my ligaments. So with regular physical activity, with enough rest there, okay, that will strengthen our connective tissues. So one reason why we don't want people to be inactive or immobile, okay, because this leads to a decrease in strength, and our ligaments and tendons might actually become shorter. Because if we're not actively moving them in a range of motion there, our body doesn't recognize the need to keep them as long, and therefore they might shorten. With age there, all connective tissues ultimately will increase in strength about till the age of 30. So roughly the age of 30 there, our bones can get stronger, our muscles can get stronger, our tendons can get stronger there. After this point in time there, though, strength will start to decrease. Bones become more brittle and less tough there. Tendons and ligaments there become less stiff, meaning they're more likely to tear. Now, the nice thing is with exercise, we can slow down this brittle process of bones, and we can slow down this less stiff process that occurs with tendons and ligaments there, which is why, again, we recommend that people exercise throughout their lifespan. Now, you might have seen tendons and ligaments and might think they are the same thing, but they are a little bit different. Tendons connect muscles to bones, versus ligaments connect two different bones together. Likewise there, tendons have fibers that are arranged in parallel, meaning that the fibers lie along the same line. So they are very stiff and have high tensile strength, but they cannot handle compression, meaning if the top and the bottom here are smushed very well, and they can't handle shear forces very well. So if I had a force coming from the right and from the left, they don't handle those forces very well there. Now ligaments, compared to tendons there, have more elastin. And what you'll notice here is their fiber arrangement there kind of crosses each other, okay? Which means that the ligaments are typically less stiff, and slightly weaker than tendons, so therefore you can't pull on as much on a ligament there as you could a tendon. Okay? But they can carry non-axial loads very well. So we talked about ligaments connecting bones together, and ligaments their purpose there is to help with joint stabilization. Okay? They are flexible enough to allow for some movement, but their goal there is to keep the joints stable. Now understand there with ligaments there, as ligament tension will change as the joint range of motion changes, okay? Joint stability becomes very dependent on that joint position. So if the joint is flexed in a position, it might change how strong ligaments are in there, versus if the joint is extended, how is our ligaments, how do they affect the joint stability there? Ligaments themselves may not be sufficient enough to protect joints in all possible joint situations there. I like to think about ligaments in terms of guardrails on a cliff. So as I'm driving my car along a cliff there, we've got guardrails that prevent you from going off the ledge. Could you collide with that guardrail and ride that guardrail up? Yeah, you could. So as a car, you could actually do that there. However, okay, you might reach a weak point in that guardrail, or you might produce so much force so quickly that you would break that guardrail and would go careening off the edge. This is why it's important that we drive not on the guardrail. We use the guardrails kind of as a last second help there, and instead we stay off of the guardrail whenever possible. And I like to think about staying off the guardrails in terms of using our muscles and our tendons effectively, so we don't have to use our ligaments to produce a ton of force there to keep our joints together. So that's why one thing we can do to try to prevent a joint dislocation there is that it's important there to know what is coming. So for example, if I'm jumping up into the air, I know eventually I'm going to land on the ground. Okay? And if I know I'm going to land on the ground there, I can activate my leg muscles so that I can absorb that impact when I hit the ground. So this is what co-contraction refers to. By activating the muscles, okay, in advance there of actually producing force. So therefore I can brace myself before I hit the ground. Now, let's take another situation, okay, where you are, let's say, for example, you're sitting in a chair, and one of your buddies decides to pull a prank on you, and they slide that chair out very quickly from underneath you. You're not prepared to hit the ground in that case. So in that case there, when they slide out the chair, your body's going to fall. Your muscles might not have time to co-contract to help brace yourself for impact. Therefore, you might be at a greater risk for getting injured in a case when you are surprised by what's coming up. That's why, again, we want to be prepared whenever possible when we are exercising there in order to help prevent injury there. Flexibility versus joint laxity. Okay, so what stretching does, okay, it helps improve our range of motion, okay, in muscle and tendon units there. Stretching is positive there, okay. However, we don't want ligaments to stretch. So muscles, tendons stretching, that's totally cool. Ligament stretching, though, those are not good because we might create some joint laxity. Joint laxity meaning that joint is now more unstable because that ligament there is stretched out. which is one reason why people who are hyperflexible typically are at a greater risk of getting injured, even more than some people who might actually be tight. The other thing about flexibility is not general, but it's really very highly specific. So therefore, for example, you might be very flexible in your shoulder joints, but you might not be very flexible in your ankle joints. So it's flexibility there is very specific there. When we work on our flexibility training, it seems like more of the improvements of flexibility happen due to an extensibility of the tendons as opposed to the muscles. Meaning that by stretching there, working on range of motion there, it's our tendons that actually become stretchier there, okay, versus the muscles themselves actually getting longer. When looking at a workout program there, okay, if we're trying to focus on strength improvement there, typically we see an improvement in strength in the first 6 to 8 weeks. Now, this is not necessarily due to a change in the muscle fibers. It's not necessarily really our muscle fibers getting stronger. Typically, the first 6 to 8 weeks of a training program sees improvements in neuromuscular control and efficiency, essentially meaning you become better at doing the movement. After 6 to 8 weeks, that's typically when we might see a greater increase in muscle size, or we'll see a greater increase in muscle hypertrophy. Because at that point in time, we've learned how to do the movement pretty well, so our improvements in doing the movement well will slow down very quickly, which means in order for us to continue to move heavier weights there, our muscle actually has to get bigger. So that's why in order to see muscle size gains there, muscle hypertrophy, you want to see a program last at least 8 weeks or longer. Now, tendons through strength training also can become stronger, more resistant there, but understand there that the rate of adaptation is slower than that of muscle, meaning that your tendons will not get as strong as quickly as muscles will. It's one reason why bodybuilders who take steroids, they will see a great increase in their muscle size, which is awesome, but their tendons can't maintain that pace. So it's one reason why people, if you try to use too much weight too quickly and you're taking steroids, your muscles might be too strong for your tendons, leading to a greater risk of injury. That's all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day. Booyah.